Is James Harden washed up? After getting traded to the Philadelphia 76ers, the expectation and hope was the Sixers would be a championship or bust team. But after the poor play of James Harden throughout the entire playoffs, the Sixers were only able to make it to the second round. And after that poor performance, a lot of people are wondering if James Harden is going in the direction of a washed up player. But quickly before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionative NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. For a very long time now, James Harden was always known as one of the best players in the NBA. The statistics that he put up during the regular season in terms of his points per game, his assists per game, and also his rebounds per game just made him one of the best players in the NBA and also won him an MVP award. But the great thing about James Harden is not only did he put up great individual statistics to help his team win as well. And you could really see this in his days with the Houston Rockets, as the Rockets were always one of the better teams in the Western Conference. But it seemed like things were starting to change once James Harden formally requested a trade out of Houston. At that time, James Harden was clubbing each and every night rather than working on his individual game. He also put on a ton of weight, and overall it was just very clear that Harden did not want to be a part of the Houston Rockets organization anymore. And at the time, a lot of people saw this as a tactic James Harden was using in order to get traded out of Houston, and once he did get his wish and once he got traded out of Houston, he would go back to the same old James Harden that we all knew and loved, and would lose all that weight that he put on and would once again focus on basketball. And early on, once Harden got traded to the Brooklyn Nets, that's exactly what was happening. He was once again putting up phenomenal numbers, he was looking a lot better out there on the court, and he was also starting to lose weight as well. And in his first season with the Brooklyn Nets, he averaged 25 points on 47% shooting from the field, 8.5 rebounds, and 10.9 assists. But not only was James Harden putting up phenomenal numbers, he was also doing a phenomenal job at helping his team win, and also doing a phenomenal job at playing with guys in Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant on the court at the same time, which was a big question mark once Harden got traded to the Nets. And although those three guys weren't necessarily on the court all that often during the regular season, when they were on the court all together, it was pretty clear that this team was the most dominant team in the NBA, and most people thought once it came down to the playoffs, the Nets would be able to win an NBA championship relatively easily due to the fact that their main three stars were so dominant once all playing together. But once it came down to the playoffs, their stars started to get injured, but specifically talking about James Harden in this video, he went down with a hamstring injury in their second round matchup versus the Milwaukee Bucks. And later on in that series, he ended up coming back, but it was pretty clear that Harden was not healthy whatsoever, and the Nets ended up losing that series to the Bucks. And although it was certainly disappointing that the Nets didn't end up winning the NBA championship that season, the prevailing thought was the Nets would just get their stars healthy ready for next season, and once the playoffs did come around next season, the Nets would be able to win an NBA championship then. But once the next season did end up starting, which was this year, the Nets certainly did struggle pretty significantly early on, and during the NBA trade deadline, James Harden once again requested a trade out of Brooklyn. Well, he didn't formally request a trade out of Brooklyn, but he made it pretty clear that he wanted to get traded out of there, and he wanted to go to the Philadelphia 76ers. And during the trade deadline, the Nets did oblige and ended up trading him to the Philadelphia 76ers. And obviously, as I mentioned before in the video, once this trade did happen, it was championship or bust for Philadelphia. But once the playoffs started, the Sixers ended up losing in the second round to the Miami Heat, and part of the reason was certainly due to the fact that Joel Embiid wasn't playing for most of that series, but also the fact that James Harden was playing so poorly in that year's playoffs, really as a whole, was very concerning for a lot of Sixers fans. And at this point, after poor play in the playoffs this year, as well as poor play in the playoffs last year for the Brooklyn Nets, the question is James Harden starting to become washed up? Well, in my opinion, I really think this comes down to a few different factors. The main factor and the main reason that I personally think James Harden is playing so poorly as of late is the fact that he suffered that hamstring injury all the way back in the playoffs with the Brooklyn Nets. And I think it's pretty clear, at least in my opinion, that he's still suffering the effects from that injury, and maybe he should have sat out for a longer period of time than he actually did. So I personally think that hamstring injury has a lot to do with how poorly he has been playing as of late. But at the same time, I also want to say that I don't necessarily think James Harden is exactly the same player that he was in the past with the Houston Rockets. I certainly think there is some slippage from that time, but I also don't want to make excuses for James Harden, because there certainly are some negative things that I have been seeing with James Harden as of late. And the main thing that I wanted to touch upon is the fact that James Harden is once again going to the club a lot, and he's not necessarily focusing on his game at least as much as he did in the past. And it just seems like at this point that James Harden is completely just not a team player whatsoever, as once he was with the Houston Rockets, he requested a trade or really forced his way out of Houston, and then once he got his wish and got traded to the Brooklyn Nets, he didn't like his situation there, and once again requested a trade out of Brooklyn, and it seems like at this point he's not necessarily all that thrilled about being in Philadelphia. And that's not necessarily something that he flat out said, but it seems like based upon his actions, he's not all that thrilled about being here. And what I mean by that is Harden is once again going clubbing a lot of nights, and he's not necessarily completely focused on his basketball career. At least that's what it looks like to me personally. So I certainly think the fact that Harden isn't necessarily completely focused on his NBA game, at least that's what it looks like to me personally, is another factor for why he's not necessarily playing all that well as of late. So in my opinion, I think what's happening is James Harden isn't necessarily going to get to the level that he was back in Houston, and that level was an MVP type guy, so I certainly think there's certain slippage compared to that, but at the same time, I still think James Harden is going to play at a very high level, at an all-star type level. So if you want to say James Harden is washed up compared to what he was back in Houston, I think that's fair, but at the same time, James Harden at a washed up level is still a phenomenal talent and is still an all-star type guy, at least in my opinion, because I think the extremely poor play that Harden has been showing as of late is more so of an anomaly and is not necessarily going to determine how well Harden does play for the rest of his career. But of course, there is a possibility that I could be wrong about this, and maybe Harden will be completely washed up for the rest of his career and would be nowhere near an all-star type guy anymore, but I just don't personally think that will be the case. But one thing that I would like to see out of James Harden going forward is I would certainly like to see him become more of a team player going forward and not request a trade out of Philadelphia and try to find a way to win with this Philadelphia team, because I certainly think they have enough talent to do so with Joel Embiid and James Harden at the top, as well as a pretty decent roster around those guys. Harden just needs to completely buy in. And if Harden is able to do that going forward and the Sixers are able to have a lot of success going forward, I certainly think that Harden could have a very successful career going forward. So we'll see what happens going forward with James Harden. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think James Harden is washed up, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy it, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.